Welcome back, everybody. Today we're discussing Westworld, Season 3, Episode 3, The Absence of Field. Before we jump into the video, I'd like to officially announce the channel's first ever sponsor. The Salty Nerd Podcast is a fun new podcast where a bunch of nerds get together and discuss your favorite TV shows, movies, and pop culture with a salty, sometimes spicy, look at the entertainment industry. The Salty Nerd Podcast is available on YouTube, iTunes, iHeartRadio, or wherever else you may listen to podcasts. I highly recommend you give them a listen, but without further ado, let's overthink an HBO show about robots. Starting with the title, The Absence of Field is referring to a poem by Mark Strand called Keeping Things Whole. It's a brief poem discussing this idea of being the disturbance in a natural state of things. I think most prevalent to this episode, it's referring to a host being in Hale's body and the struggle of being this person in the real world. The big reveal of this episode was something we theorized all the way back in Season 2, that Until Sunday was my biggest flop as a theory, because it was flat out wrong. I mean, Hale's story was simply that of a ruthless board member doing whatever she had to get this information out for Delos. I even made a bet in that video that if she wasn't working for a third-party company, I would tattoo something onto my body. I'm glad this is the internet and no one held me accountable to do that, but can you imagine how hyped I was when they said a mole existed in the company, and then the episode ended with it actually being her, meaning it now makes sense why Carl Strand and team waited 2 weeks to assist the people on the island. The entire time Charlotte was reaching out, and all the other oddities I point out in the Charlotte the Betrayer video, now linked above, it was her trying to get this information out of the park to another company, and of course, we now know that company is Insight, which was my biggest criticism of Season 2. Since they didn't confirm that she was working for another company last season, it literally painted this picture of them trusting a single board member to secure trillions in IP by herself. This will drastically reshape this character, and our rewatches will probably be more enjoyable now knowing that this was actually what was going on. And of course, our next task as theory crafters is to figure out who is exactly inside Charlotte Hale now and what the fork is going on with Dolores and Caleb. The episode begins with Hale and the night of the massacre crawling to record a message for her son Nathan. What's interesting to me is that we get his name for the first time ever at the exact same time that we learn what Charlotte Hale's middle name is, Elizabeth. It was like thrown into the same sentence as if it meant anything to us, because it's odd doing this for a character that we already know. After some digging, it turns out that Nathan Hale was a spy during the American Revolution, the one who was credited in saying, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." And it turns out, if you search the word Elizabeth on his Wikipedia page, you will find a single entry, that being his mother. It's really not conclusive of anything, but it's interesting that now the mother is the spy, and yeah, I don't know. Nathan Hale was caught and executed publicly for being a spy, so it could perhaps maybe be foreshadowing that as the fate of our dear Charlotte Hale as well. We then come to her sitting with Dolores just after she's rebuilt in Arnold's old home. The million-dollar question that still can't be answered, and I'm working on a theory video about right now, is who is inside Charlotte Hale. Of course, the episode was written perfectly and left to be as ambiguous as humanly possible. We do get a ton of clues, and again, all of those could either be red herrings or point to different people that really don't make sense in the grand scheme of things. But there is an idea of Dolores splitting her personality, her Wyatt and Dolores personality, so stay tuned for that later on. What I can point out in this scene that I think other reviewers are completely overlooking is that this takes place at a very interesting point in the story. Consider the emotion of Hale at the end of Season 2 standing next to Dolores and Bernard. This character is very much not what we see this episode. She is fragile and learning. We're seeing the progression of this character, meaning this happens before Bernard gets 3D printed back into existence, and it's really strange to consider that maybe all of this happens before Bernard comes back, meaning what else happens before Bernard comes back? The showrunners want us to believe that she left the island, came to Arnold's house, rebuilt Bernard, but I'm suggesting that we're seeing events, or will see events, before he was created, and exactly why Dolores knew that they wouldn't be friends when he comes to life. It's both proof that another Season 2 layout exists, where they tell the start and ending of the story and then slowly fill in the middle until we have a complete picture, and perhaps evidence that Bernard's entire plot was a manifestation of Dolores's. Also, because we know Hale in some capacity is inside Surak's inner circle, we may see evidence of her already accessing Rehoboam. Dolores says that without Delos, there would never be any more of their kind, stating outright why they wish to keep the company above water and in their control. She grabs Bernard's pearl, and I am super excited to know that this red pearl was Bernard, because Dolores recreating him from memory, like it was implied at the end of season 2, is hugely problematic. I think I talked about this at some point, but there's just so many variables that come with hosts being able to recreate each other strictly from memory. So I'm glad that they're not making that statement. The episode has another point of interest in the ring here: elevated scrutiny, San Francisco. The coordinates can be viewed in the description below, but I couldn't really find anything out of the ordinary or some kind of interest in this area outside of the show telling us exactly where this takes place, which is really odd because we know that Arnold's house is nowhere near San Francisco. It's near the South China Sea. We then come to Delos HQ and a riot control bot being created. A total of 300 are currently in storage. I think it's pretty heavily implied that they don't plan on selling them here like the assistant states, but it seems like they're trying to build an army, which plainly shows us that we're missing a scene here between Dolores and Hale preparing this plan. It's the only time this is ever mentioned, this army, this, outright assault on anything, and it is quickly glossed over, and I think that's really interesting. Hale is informed that hundreds of companies are buying stock to the point of owning 38% of the company. This, we find out, is Surak. Also note that this pregnant businesswoman, and God, I hope she's pregnant because I feel like an ass otherwise, but this person is 100,000% shown for a reason. Pregnancy is a great way to show different time periods without stating it outright, and Westworld doesn't state it outright for whatever reason. Not saying the showrunners aren't woke enough to simply cast a pregnant businesswoman, but everything means something in Westworld, right? And this would be a great subtle hint for us to catch on to. We next come to Caleb and Dolores. He calls for medical assistance, and we get a purposeful shot of her reaching for his hand. I believe this is to ensure that he comes with her. I have no doubt in my mind that this was all a part of her plan to get him to join her. The medical professionals don't know how to treat people without a machine telling them what to do, further showcasing humanity's inability if things go south. Also shows us that Caleb has this medical knowledge, likely pointing to his service in the military. As soon as the Rico men show up, she moves like nothing is wrong. I think she was testing Caleb. She needed to know if he was a good man or not, someone who would protect the quote-unquote innocent, along with this information about meeting somebody at the underpass. I think this is huge evidence that this was all a part of her plan. I think the bigger question is how she knew that she would need Caleb, and if she knew, why test him at all, unless this was strictly for Caleb and the emotional human side that needed this relationship bonding. After all, this was the moment where Caleb sees something truly real for the first time in a long time, and without it, he wouldn't have gotten into the mix of things later on. She leaves him behind, and we then transition back to Hale. We learn that Surak is worth roughly $1 trillion, and that Insight and Delos had their first encounter roughly 20 years ago. 20 years ago from 2058 doesn't really align to anything in this timeline, other than it was around the time that Ford started rebuilding Bernard. It's unclear if that's the connection, but I will say that Arnold and Ford's story do seem to mirror Liam Dempsey Sr. and Surak's story in more ways than one. It'll be interesting if they have a deeper connection, possibly also giving us an outlet to bring Anthony Hopkins back into the mix of things, which is always welcomed. She goes home and finds her ex and her child, Nathan. He knows that something is up. This is not his mother, and the suspicion is really worrying. Also note that the pattern in his pillow here heavily favors the pattern that we see in the opening credits. We then come to Hale dealing with the leak, and we learn that Maeve was stolen along with a handful of others. We did kind of already know this, but it's kind of interesting. Once everything went belly up, it was easy for Surak to swoop in and steal what he needed. But if he was already planning the takeover of this company, why was this step needed at all? I don't know, something just feels really off with this. But she takes off, and we get a kind of panic attack and her cutting herself before meeting Dolores in the hotel lobby. While she's waiting for Dolores, we see that she's been hurting herself and has something on her face. At first, I thought this was a mole, but I'm more inclined to believe that it's simply dried blood. Though, I don't know, keep an eye on this if it does come back up, because at first to me it felt like the Bernard bullet scar trick from season 2. The marks on Hale's skin are also really interesting to me. It reminds me of Dolores' pulling at the strings of herself in season 1, possibly what would happen if she kept pulling. See these kind of marks, though it isn't clear what this layout is actually indicating. Like, it doesn't seem like it's the seam of her skin, you know what I mean? But she reveals that Surak is trying to gain control of Delos, and at this point of the story, Dolores knows who he is. Dolores begs Hale not to let them lose control over Delos, and that she must visit an old friend in order to convince the board to counteroffer. The only person I think this could be is William, and of course we never see this happen in the episode, so again, probable timeline play, or it's going to happen later on. Dolores tells Hale that she belongs to her and not to hurt herself again. They cuddle, and we get a brief clip of Caleb being taken for helping Dolores. Dolores puts in a contact lens, which is interesting because the only time we've ever seen these kind of glasses or lenses is twice now, and it's used to manipulate the scene. The first is with the glass tied to the man's face to reveal the story of his dead wife, and then at the end of this episode with Charlotte Hale. It makes me wonder if anything we see this episode after this point is simply the projection of, because it doesn't come up later again, and we don't see her use this yet. Dolores takes off to save Caleb, and we see that he's being tortured with the implant that was drilled into the roof of his mouth. Now, this likely came during his military training, and it's likely the same thing that we see being drilled into the roof of William's mouth in the trailers. It controls him like a host, and probably not to the same level, but they use it to raise his heart rate like a sliding scale. George the robot comes to the rescue, quickly loses the fight, and we get flashbacks of him and Francis as friends before the military, and this shot of him from the trailer with the eyeball mask. We have this and another shot of Francis in a orange jumpsuit from a different trailer, so the picture that I'm painting in my mind is of him being left as a child, turning to a life of crime, finding this person along the way, and ultimately getting caught. I imagine it's entirely possible that Francis took the blame for this scene because it's actually us seeing Caleb is the one holding the gun here, but Francis ultimately in prison. They might have offered Francis a reduced sentence in exchange for military service, kind of like him saying goodbye in this short clip, and I imagine that Caleb maybe joined the military to serve alongside Francis, meaning he feels responsible for Francis's death since it was his fault that they were there in the first place, adding to the tragedy of his character. Dolores saves the day, and we get a nice shot of this tablet. I've received a good bit of feedback that people enjoy when I do the close-ups like this. I've always just done that because I enjoy the close-ups, so if that is something you enjoyed, let me know. We then come back to Hale at the Delos HQ, and she listens to the recording meant for her son. It looks to ignite something inside of Hale, and then she gets another code from Surak and walks to the park. This is the best shot of the season so far. This scene was so incredibly revealing about who she was as a person, so well written. I loved every second of it. It adds so much complexity to the person behind the scenes, and it screams parental to me. This level of vengeance, and I just can't place who it is. I thought for sure she was going to let him go, not wanting to risk the plan for the murder of this person, but she doesn't. In that moment, she feels most like herself and even calls herself a predator. Now we just have to figure out who that most likely points to. We arrive back with Dolores and Caleb in an old school diner that feels so incredibly out of place in the future world. It feels like a neat retro place that sure we could see today, but it also has escaped the millionaires buying up the property in the area, including the hair and nail salon across the street. What we learn in this scene, paired with the knowledge of Dolores putting on the contact lenses directly before this, makes me feel really uneasy. She reveals that this was the place that he was abandoned at as a child, showing the power of data that Insight has collected, telling us not only how they collected this data, but that it was used by Rehoboam to create a mirror world of the real world, adding to the simulation theory and us having to question literally everything we see as real or not. They walk to the boardwalk where he will kill himself in 10 to 12 years, showing him the systems that control the people and how he hasn't been lucky in life because the string pullers don't want to invest in someone who is going to die so early. Dolores wants Caleb to join her and offers him a choice, which is something new to Dolores. Previously, she would have just altered the code of the loved one because it was easier, but this could signal a genuine change in Dolores. At the same time, so much of this feels like Dolores' manipulation masked as offering him a choice. We come back to Hale deciphering the message and being taken to Surak. He worries that she isn't with him any longer, and we learn that he is looking for the guest data. He says that he predicted the massacre, and he tried to warn as much. Now, Hale says that someone downloaded it from the satellite, which I'm not sure why she would reveal that, but it does signal for the first time clearly that the encryption key and the data are now in two separate places and not sent off together. In fact, the encryption key is in Dolores, and Surak knows this somehow, meaning we still need to see what happens from the time that Maeve and Surak meet to him knowing this information. It ends with a threat letting Hale know that her time is limited, carrying much more weight because he believes that he can see the future of the human Hale. But with that, we come to the end of the video. Special thank you to all the wonderful people that have chosen to donate their real-life money to support this channel. You are the bee's knees. Our top-tier donors this month are Micheal, Linck, Robert Holtz, Jeff Chunn, Logan, Feewet, Elliott, Enriquez, and our newest member, Melissa Fassetta. If I left anything out that you'd like the community to know, please sound off in the comments below. Much love, everybody. Thank you once again, and I can't wait to talk to you all again soon.